Hi, this is Mrs. McConnell. You may vaguely remember me from the first week of school and our cave paintings lesson. At the time, I mentioned I might reappear from time to time. This is one of those occasions. The question we explored together was when we looked at the cave paintings in Lascaux was, what can we learn about these people who left no other history just from looking at their art? So, for example, we learned that they were willing to use up a great deal of a resource necessary for survival, animal fat, to make paint that would stick to cave walls. That told us that the cave art was very, very important to them, even if it didn't tell us precisely what it meant. Now, the Egyptians actually left us a great deal of history, and eventually historians figured out how to translate hieroglyphics and therefore to read some of that history. But we can still learn a lot about the Egyptians from their art. Over the next 2 days, you're going to see several pieces of Egyptian art and architecture. You should take notes about these works in the notes template Ms. Jacobs has given you, and she'll also tell you what you need to know for the test. At the end of these 2 days, you are going to write a short essay that I will grade. I've put the essay question here on the slide. No, when I say evidence from the work, I mean specific information about what you actually see when you look at a statue or a painting or a building. We'll talk about this some as we go along. So on to Egypt. This slide gives just a quick overview of dates. And again, Ms. Jacobs will tell you what you need to know and what you don't need to remember. Mostly, I want you to realize just how long a history we're talking about. It's also somewhat helpful to keep the Old and New Kingdom straight, especially when looking at Egyptian architecture. So here's a shortcut. In the Old Kingdom, the Egyptians built pyramids. In the New Kingdom, the Egyptians built temples. But we're not looking at pyramids or temples just yet. We're going to start with Egyptian sculpture, and more specifically with the earliest existing labeled work of historic art that we have. It's the palette of King Narmer, shown here. Before we get to this work, though, I want to take you on a quick tour through Egyptian history, looking at a series of statues. This is a pharaoh and his wife from the Old Kingdom, about 500 years after the work that you just saw. And here, 1,000 years later, is a pharaoh from the New Kingdom. This is getting a little ahead of our story, but I just note that while this pharaoh's image has all the usual pharaoh symbols, we'll talk about these, and those include a false beard, this pharaoh was in fact a female. Stay tuned. Let's fast forward another 800 years. This is a late period pharaoh who, to me at least, sure looks a lot like the Old Kingdom pharaoh and the New Kingdom pharaohess. At least this Roman period ruler is not disguising that she's a female. This is Cleopatra VII. That's the famous Cleopatra, the one who hung out with Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. Again, stay tuned. I'm sure you'll be talking about that later in your course. So just to put this 2,500-year history of Egyptian art into perspective, let's look at what happens in about the same period of time in Western European art. In other words, what happens in 2,500 years of Western European art. We start with a Greek statue from around 600 BCE, and fast forward 100 years to a Byzantine empress. This is actually a mosaic. And fast forward another 1,000 years to Michelangelo's famous statue of David. Let me pause here just for a moment and talk about how you might answer the essay question using this work if you were studying the Italian Renaissance, which you were not. Well, right away, this statue tells us three important things about Florence, Italy in the 1500s. First, Florence was a small republic under attack from big empires to the north, empires in what today is France and Germany. So why would they like the story of David and Goliath? Well, little David slew huge Goliath, right? And little Israel defeated the stronger Philistines. The Florentines liked that story. Second, this actually looks a lot like classical Greek sculptures, and I've included a Greek sculpture, that bronze sculpture on the right. The people of Florence were fascinated with ancient Greece and Rome, and in fact, they were trying to recover the glories of that ancient world. Renaissance actually is a French word meaning rebirth, and they were talking about the rebirth of the classical world. And third and finally, the Florentines were humanists. That's a term you'll learn about next year in Western Civ. In other words, they deeply admired the human body and the human mind and spirit. And that shows up in this statue as well. So we see that David is physically beautiful. He's really a human ideal. His expression, meanwhile, suggests that he is thoughtful and intelligent. He really doesn't look like somebody who's about to fight a war. He looks like somebody who's reading a tough book. At any rate, you don't get to write about David since it's not an Egyptian work, but this should give you some idea of what I mean by a claim about the relationship between the work and art, and by support from a description of the work for that claim. Now, to resume our rush through Western European art history, here near the end of our 2,500 years is A Lady from the Early 20th Century by Picasso. So, in 2,500 years, the art of Western Europe changes enormously. The art of ancient Egypt barely changes at all. So, let's go back and look at our first work. This is the Palette of Narmer, the oldest labeled work of art in existence today. This artifact has generated a lot of controversy, and it's mostly over whether it was created to commemorate an actual event or whether it recounts a myth about the founding of Egypt. We're going to explore a little of that history in a minute, but let's just look at this palette first. I should note, by the way, that this actual use for this object was as a palette for mixing eye makeup. The Egyptian mosaic I've shown here demonstrates an eye with that thick kohl makeup, which, by the way, may have been put on in part to protect their eyes from the sun, which is pretty fierce in Egypt. At any rate, back to the palette. What do you see? What do you think might be happening? In other words, before we talk about this, just use your eyes. What do you see? Well, there's the big guy with a funny hat who looks like he's holding onto somebody's hair. There are the two bizarre animals with the entwined necks. And by the way, the circle formed by those necks is where the eye makeup went. On the bottom of one panel, we see a bull hovering over a man. At the top of both panels, we see cows. We'll talk in a moment about what some of this might mean. But for now, I'd like you to learn a little bit about the king who is probably being commemorated, King Narmer. So we're going to turn to a video that talks about this first unifying dynasty. The first clip introduces the controversy. Is this or is this not a commemoration of a real historical event? Now, I'm skipping over a very interesting segment that shows archaeologists finding other evidence that seems to confirm that Narmer was a real king who really fought the papyrus people of the north and unified Egypt. I should note that whatever the video says, this is not actually an entirely settled issue. But I'd also note that archaeologists often find evidence that so-called myths, in fact, had a lot of basis in historical fact. The second video clip continues the story and gives you a better look at this work of art. So maybe, even probably, this work conveys some reasonably accurate history. Still, it is a highly symbolic work that also shows some of the ways that pharaohs would use art to support their right to rule. So, first we see a religious justification for rule. King Narmer is shown appealing to the gods. That's up in the back where you see the king and a number of figures. He's also identified with the god himself. In the Egyptian religion, pharaohs are godlike during their reign, and then they become actual gods when they die. Specifically, they move from being Horus, the kind of bird god, to Osiris. So what would you guess is the second way that this work of art proclaims the king's right to rule in Egypt? Well, let's get practical here. This is a guy who can win wars. So let's quickly run through some of the symbolism, starting with the front. We see a larger-than-life King Narmer wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, slaying an enemy. We also see that papyrus growing out of somebody's head, a kind of unclear symbol, but you see it there. We also see the falcon god Horus taking a papyrus plant captive. So what does that plant symbolize according to the video? It symbolizes Lower Egypt. So again, the pharaoh as God is taking control of Lower Egypt. And although this is a little hard to see, Horus is actually holding a human arm that attaches to a rope holding the defeated enemy with the papyrus symbol of Lower Egypt. On top, we see the symbol for the goddess Hathor. She's the divine mother of the pharaoh in the Egyptian religion, and her symbol is a cow. Since in Egyptian mythology, she gave milk to the pharaoh. Again, the pharaoh is using this work of art to identify with the gods and to show his respect for the gods at the same time. And finally, we see a couple of naked dead enemies on the bottom. Showing enemies naked, by the way, is one of the ways that works from the ancient Near East tend to show enemies as being defeated. So it's common to lots of works of Near Eastern art. Okay, turning to the other side of the palette. So how has the king's headdress changed? They talked about that in the video. Now he has the headdress of Upper and Lower Egypt. On the upper right, you see him confronting 10 beheaded enemies. And again, it's a little tough to see. You actually had a better view of this in the video. But these enemies have missing heads and other missing body parts sticking between their legs. What's most striking are those strange beasts. Their entwined necks may be a symbol of unification. Again, this is something that art historians and archaeologists argue about. In the lower panel, what art historians call a register at the very bottom. By the way, the registers were used to tell a story, just kind of the way comic books do today. You follow a story by going down the page. What you see is a bull lowering his head and stepping on an enemy, and as usual, a naked enemy. So what would you guess that the bull symbolizes? Well, in a lot of societies, in the ancient Near East and in Europe as well, think of bullfighting, bulls symbolize strength. They also symbolize, sorry ladies, virility. Let me make just a few more notes about this work. The circled picture between the two cow goddesses is actually the hieroglyph for Narmer, and that's why this palette is considered the first labeled work of art. Narmer is shown in what is called composite perspective, which again is typical of Near Eastern art. So you see his face in profile, but his eye is facing forward. His shoulders face forward, but below the waist he's shown in profile. Obviously, this is not how any real person looks, but it's a convention that it is a way that pharaohs are always portrayed. And if you think about it, it also is a way of giving a fair amount of information about a figure. Basically, this is using art to be descriptive rather than to purely represent what the eye would see, what we call optical art. Finally, this work uses what is called hierarchy of scale. Put simply, Narmer is bigger than his servant, who's shown on the left carrying his sandals, and he's a lot bigger than his enemies. Again, the artist is not trying to portray the pharaoh realistically. We have no reason to assume that Narmer was 3 times taller than his enemies. Instead, the artist is using size to show that the pharaoh is much more important than anyone else. Hint, hint, that would be a good point to put into your essay if you chose to do the palette of Narmer. Okay, now we're moving into the height of the Old Kingdom, the period of the Great Pyramids at Giza. One of the 3 great pyramids at Giza is the Pyramid of Khafre, and he's shown here. He's also, by the way, probably the king whose face appears on the Great Sphinx. Do you see a resemblance? So why, by the way, would a pharaoh be portrayed this way? What message might the pharaoh be sending with a sphinx? Well, we've already learned that pharaohs were seen as and portrayed as being both men and gods. Here we see this in a way by combining a man with a beast. So we see that headdress, which is one of the symbols of the pharaoh. But what would the lion's body mean? Well, like bulls, Lions often stand for strength. They also stand for fierceness. It's a royal symbol in many cultures, not just in the ancient Near East, but in Europe as well. So we're going to turn now from Egyptian sculpture to Egyptian painting. It's important to remember that in Egyptian art, everything related to the afterlife. And most of the art we find is in tombs. This just gives you a sense of how richly painted these tombs would have been. This may be the single most famous Egyptian painting from the Book of the Dead, found in the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, or King Tut. These images were painted not on the tomb wall, but on papyrus scrolls. Here you see a larger picture of the same image, which I think is very cool. And we're going to look at one more video that explains what is happening in this work. And then if you have time, and I hope you do, Ms. Jacobs will take you on a virtual tour of the tomb of Queen Nefertari.